pals, I'm here today to talk to you about my favourite reads of 2022. I went through the list of all the books I read, which was 96 books, and just picked out the ones that I'd given 5 stars, and there was also a couple that I'd given like 4.5 stars that I wanted to include, and I just happened to get to the number 10, which is a lovely number to talk about. I'm really pleased with that. There are 3 books I reread that I gave 5 stars to, but I'm not going to mention them here because I would have featured them in like favourite books of the year videos when I originally read them. But they have really spurred me on to do a lot more rereading this year. And I used to reread absolutely loads when I was like a child and a teenager. Like I very rarely picked up a new to me book, and I just remember the joy I used to get out of that. So I really want to like embrace that this year. But I'm going to be talking about 10 sort of new to me books. I'm going to talk about the 2 4.5 star reads first. And I want to sort of caveat this with, when I gave a book 4.5 stars, I probably absolutely loved reading it, which is the case with both of these books. That with both of them, there's something I can criticise. And so for me, that means like I can't give it a 5 stars, because when I give the book 5 stars, I want to feel like there's nothing that I want to criticise. So yeah, but I really love these 2 and would still recommend them, probably as much as all the others. But yeah, I just wanted to caveat that. So the first one is a marker for this series in general, and that is Rules of Ascension, which is book 1 of the Winds of the Foreland series by David B. Coe. I heard Chris from Chris's Bookish Cauldron talk about this series and really liked the sound of it, and so picked it up, and I read the first 3 books in 2022, and I have the last 2 to read, and I'm hoping to read them as soon as possible. So this is a high epic fantasy series that is very political in nature. It's pretty complicated. And the premise is you open up with this world where there's like 6 or 7 countries, humans rule all these countries, but they have this other race called the Circe, who are sort of physically weak, but magically very gifted, and they are advisors to sort of lords, ladies and kings. And the reason they're in this position is because hundreds of years ago, there was a Circe uprising. I think the Circe live like to the south of all these humans, and they invaded the countries where all these humans lived and tried to overthrow them and basically like subjugate them with their magical abilities. But they lost. And after that, they became sort of like second-class citizens and are really not trusted, but have still managed to become advisors because their magical abilities mean they're just like very gifted in lots of ways. And when this book opens, there is what appears to be a Circe uprising to sow distrust and discontent between all these different countries, so that they sort of will go to war with one another. And when they're left in ruins, the Circe can sort of rise up and take over. And so across the 3 books, it opens up more and more and more. By the book I'm in, I think there's like 4 countries involved. I have written my own character list. There's an insane amount of characters, and it's just super interesting because you get to watch it from all perspectives. So you see it from the perspectives of Circe, who are part of the rebellion, Circe who are against the rebellion, humans who are like helping with the rebellion, or humans who aren't, and there's just a lot of distrust. And you follow these sort of 2 core characters throughout all 3 books, but other than that, there's quite a lot of other people. I'm really enjoying it. I think politically it's so well plotted. These things happen that are like a ripple effect, and it's just so smartly done. My only reason I haven't given this series 5 stars is because there are so many characters. I don't feel completely in love with any of them. There are a few characters that I definitely want to survive, but with some fantasy I've read, I like would have felt heartbroken if certain characters died, and I don't feel that way about this series, and that is simply because there are so many characters that he doesn't have enough time to sort of spend a lot of pages on just one character, and which is something I do really enjoy as a fantasy reader, although I also do really enjoy a political fantasy, which this is just like, I think probably the best political fantasy I've ever read. So there is that series which I'm really enjoying. And then the next one is an audiobook I listened to, and that is Mary Jane by Jessica Anya Blau. I heard quite a few people rave about this one, then I had a few people recommend it to me and say that they thought I would really enjoy it, and they were completely right. I absolutely loved this book. I listened to this on audio during the summer, and there were periods when it was really hot and I was just like lying on a sunbed outside in the shade. Not when it was like insanely hot, because then it was too hot, but when it wasn't too bad. And I was just lying out there with my audiobook and just listening, which is something I really rarely do because I feel weird just like sitting and listening to an audiobook and doing nothing with my hands. But I so wanted to know what was going to happen in this story that I did. So the premise of this is, if I remember correctly, is this set in like the 70s? I think it is, in Baltimore. And we're following this young girl called Mary Jane, who is a teenager, and she is raised in quite a sort of cold and aloof religious family. And she gets the opportunity to babysit for this family. And her mother allows her to babysit because she knows that the husband is a doctor, and she thinks that must mean they are very well-to-do and like equally conservative. And it turns out that actually the husband is a psychiatrist, and more specifically, he is a psychiatrist to people with addictive personalities. And this summer, they're actually housing a famous rock star and his wife, who is an equally famous actress. And they are living with them because he is an addict. And in order to recover, his psychiatrist has recommended that they sort of spend 24/7 together to try and overcome his addiction. And so when Mary Jane starts to go around their house, just initially, the family are completely different to her. They eat a lot of takeout, the house isn't tidy, there's no sort of set routine for their daughter. And she finds all that like really initially freeing, but also quite scary because she's used to so much constraints in her life. And then when she gets to know this movie star and this rock star, she just becomes really enamoured with this family, and she becomes like a key part of this family, and sort of everybody orbits around her, and she makes such a difference to them. And it's quite slice of life, like there is a plot and there are things happening, but there's nothing sort of really big or dramatic happening. It's much more this coming of age story as Mary Jane moves from this one world to another, and her eyes are just opened up to all this stuff she didn't even know existed, and she has to keep all this hidden from her own family because she knows if they find out how sort of left-wing and radical the family that she's staying with are, they would stop her going there. So absolutely love this. It was a complete joy to listen to on audio. I really recommend the audiobook. The only reason this wasn't a 5-star read is pretty much because of the last chapter. I will not spoil anything, but what I will say is this book ends quite abruptly and it is way too neat. Like the final chapter is a bit like, this feels a little bit too sweet and like it wouldn't happen and like you just wanted to tie it up with a bow. So I sort of wish the ending had been a bit different, but this is one of those books where even when I was reading it, I was thinking, do you know what, like it doesn't really matter how this book ends because it's much more about the journey, and because it is more slice of life than plot driven, I think an ending's always difficult to come to with those sort of books because it's like, well, why stop following Mary Jane now? Like I just want to watch her forever. So I really love this, would definitely pick up anything else the author writes. I don't actually know if she's written anything else, so I need to look into that, but yeah, absolutely loved this one. So I'm going to talk about the 2 non-fiction books now because I really struggle to order books when it's a mixture of fiction and non-fiction, and then I'm going to talk about the remaining fiction, and I will try and put those in a sort of a ranking order. So I'm also not great at describing what non-fiction is about, so I will do my best to talk about these 2 books. The first one is White Tears, Brown Scars, How White Feminism Betrays Women of Colour by Ruby Hamad. You can see how many tabs I put in this book. This book was absolutely brilliant, and this is a collection of sort of essays, but it is like spot on the type of book I like to read in non-fiction, in that the author doesn't shy away from talking about sort of more complex ideas, but she has a lot of reference points, and she manages to talk about these sort of social theories and have a lot of examples, like historical examples and contemporary examples. So this book is split into 2 parts, and the first part is where you're given sort of all the historical examples that build up to the prejudices we have today about different types of women. So for example, the first chapter is called Lewd Jezebels, Exotic Orientals, Princess Pocahontas, how colonialism, I think when someone talks as fast as I do, that's a really easy word to trip over, rigged the game against women of colour. The next chapter is Angry Sapphires, Bad Arabs, Dragon Ladies, Boxed in by the Binary. And then the third chapter is Only White Damsels Can Be in Distress. And all of those chapters were so fascinating, particularly that third one. I remember there was a section where she talks about how when the English and the French started to go across to what we now call the United States of America and invade it and sort of move across the US and start to, settle, in order to be able to treat black women as they did and Indigenous women as they did, they had to have this notion that made white women somehow separate. And so they treated the white woman as somebody that sort of needed protected, this sort of pure maiden that needed to be looked after. And then in order to treat women of colour the way they wanted to, they had to force these binaries that said that these are not women, these are not the same as white women, and how that has just historically been created and is perpetuated into the present day. The examples she gives are like deeply interesting. I'm doing such a poor job of describing it, but just I wish everybody would read this. And then the next section is how it continues into the present day, and just examples of how it's perpetuated and what we could do now. So for example, there's chapters like When Tears Become Weapons, White Womanhood, Silent War on Women of Colour, There Is No Sisterhood, White Women and Racism, and The Privilege and Peril of Passing, Colorism, Anti-Blackness and the Yearning to be White. I would happily reread this now because, like I said, I just learned so much from it. I will follow this author's career and read whatever she writes. I found this book so interesting, and like I said, I would love to see more people pick it up. The next book is, I guess, like a memoir in personal essays, which is some of my favourite types of books and definitely want to read more of them this year. And this one is Girlhood by Melissa Febos. I actually put this in my 5-star predictions video at the start of 2022, and it was one of the few books I was right about. I will be doing a wrap up of that 5-star prediction shortly. I absolutely love this, and this author has a couple of other books that I will definitely be picking up because I just love the way she writes. So because this is more sort of personal than the previous one, the author sort of ties together theories and discussions of different sort of social issues with her personal life that she writes in a really beautiful and lyrical way. So some of the metaphors she uses and how this is just imbued with this sort of nostalgia, but also sort of desperate sadness about being a young girl is just truly wonderful. I felt like my breath was taken away at so many points during this, just that the way in which she captured girlhood. And if you don't know, I absolutely love reading sort of coming of age stories, and I also love non-fiction about girlhood and coming of age, and I really truly think she captured those moments, but also I found the things she discussed deeply fascinating. So as an example of the topics she talks about in this, the first few chapters are more focused, as I said, on her girlhood, and one of those chapters is about that she developed quite early, and because she developed at a younger age than most girls do, she hadn't really had those discussions yet with her mother about what that might mean for her body. And so she very quickly went from being a young girl who was sort of ignored by boys and men to a young girl who was treated as a specimen, basically, because of her body. And because she didn't know how to put that into words or how to deal with that, she very quickly got sort of taken advantage of, and she became super aware of her body and felt like she didn't have any autonomy over it. There was no ability to say no. And a big discussion throughout this collection is the right to autonomy over your body as someone who identifies as femme, and how that is constantly taken away from us in every regard. So there is a whole chapter about stalkers, and how she had what we call a peeping Tom at her window, and she'll sort of look back through how that term came to be, how these men who watch women are portrayed as romantic in cinema, and how we look at it as a sort of joke, and how when you try and report those sorts of things to the police, they're like, well, there's not really anything we can do because he's not here now and he's not actually done anything to you. I found that chapter really interesting, and there's another chapter where she goes to a cuddle party which is where you pay to go, and it's for people who feel sort of disconnected from the body and want to be able to connect with other people by cuddling them, but there's not supposed to be any sort of sexual content to that. And how she felt that when she got to this cuddle party, actually it was a lot of men who felt owed, because a massive part of the cuddle party is the ability to give or deny consent to your body being held. And some people go just to be able to have a moment in their life where they say no, and have that sort of power given to them, or not taken away from them, I should say. And how a lot of the men at these cuddle parties acted, and how they acted so differently to the women, and how, why are men like that? What has been taught to them from the moment of their birth that makes them feel that they are somehow owed all these things from women. This was just, like I said, beautifully written, deeply fascinating, and I would read both these books again in a heartbeat because I got so much from them. And what I want when I read non-fiction is, clearly I want them to be about topics I'm interested in, but I also want to be pushed. I want to have to pause and reread sections to make sure I completely get it. I probably had that a little bit more with this one, just because of the way in which she writes. She at points comes across as quite sort of academic, but I want to think about things in a way that I've not come across before, and I want to sort of get a lot more context for all these discussions. And like I said, with this, it's sort of going from having like a one paragraph response to something to being able to have a 40-page response to something, to knowing all this stuff that I care about and I'm interested in so much more depth. I think if you enjoyed one of these, you'll enjoy the other in terms of the content and the themes. But like I said, they're sort of written quite differently, but I loved them both. The next book I'm going to talk about is Crow Lake by Mary Lawson. This is Mary Lawson's first novel. She's written 4, and I plan to pick up the other 3 this year because I got so much joy out of reading this one. So this book is a split narrative. It's set in the present day, which is when this book came out in the early 2000s, and then I think probably in the 70s. It takes place mainly in rural Ontario. I love this. This book is not at all new. Like, there's nothing experimental about it. It's not giving you this sort of new epic story, but it's one of those books where you can just tell she's such a skilled, masterful writer that she's telling this story that maybe you've, heard told before, but she does it all to like perfection. So the premise of this is that in the sort of present day narrative, we are following this young woman in like her late 20s who has become a professor who specialises in like pond invertebrates. And she has been invited back home to the farm her family live on for her nephew's 18th birthday party. And she's sort of differing about whether to go because she has this new partner and she doesn't really want her family to meet him because she doesn't want him to know her history. And there's all this sort of oddness about her relationship with her family. And then you go back to the past and you find out that when she was very young, her parents died in a car crash. And she had she was about, I think, 6 or 7, and her brothers were like 17 and 19. And the family sort of, I don't want to spoil anything, but stuff happened from that point on. And there is a lot of regret in the present day and a lot of things the family don't talk about. I just love this book. The themes it deals with about like the way in which different people handle situations, and the way in which both of those options can be wrong but also right, and how you can have these things that you don't discuss that then become such a barrier between people who really love one another. And also at its core, this book is a discussion about what success is and what pride can do to somebody, and if you believe that success is a certain thing, how that can be a real barrier to you having a relationship with somebody who doesn't live your idea of success. I just found this a joy to read, really easy to read, very compelling. I loved all the characters, I feel like they truly lived and breathed, and I can't wait to pick up more books from this author. The next one is another audiobook, and that is The Offing by Benjamin Myers. I loved listening to this audiobook. I had such a fun time reading it. I also read Benjamin Myers' newer novel, The Perfect Golden Circle, and just thought it was an okay read, which I was quite disappointed by after having loved The Offing. So yeah, I'd really recommend this one, and I'll definitely be trying more books by Benjamin Myers. This book is set just post World War II, and we're following this young man who's about 17, and he lives in, I think, sort of northern England, quite near Durham, and he knows he's going to effectively be a coal miner, which is what his family have always done, but he decides that before he sort of joins that trade, he would like to go on a sort of walking holiday and see a bit more of England. So he sort of sets off with his rucksack and his walking boots, and just gets work along the way that sort of pays him in like food and board. And he comes across this sort of, to him, he thinks of her as like an older woman, but I think she's probably about 50. And she lives in this sort of cottage by the sea with her dog. And she just doesn't really seem like the right type of person to have this life, because she's clearly very highly educated and she comes from money and she's very eccentric. And he sort of starts to spend time with her. And this book is a very slow moving book that's really focused on its themes. There is a lot of dialogue in this book as these two characters get to know one another, and as they both learn a lot from one another. At its core, there's this sort of love story that is touched on, and this older lady is really struggling with grief, and it's about how she tries to move through that, but just how she teaches our protagonist that there's so much more to the world that he can demand. This is at a time when if you came from a working class background, there was absolutely no way you were going to go to university. You wouldn't be welcome there, and you would get there and feel completely at sea. But she's trying to convince this young man that like nothing is impossible and that he should strive for all these things. And obviously she has the sort of money to back that up. I thought this was a really beautiful book. It has some wonderful discussions. The nature writing is absolutely stunning. The descriptions of like all their meals and just all that sort of thing was beautiful, and I found this really heartbreaking as well. So I sort of shed quite a few tears when I listened to this one, and I would definitely recommend it. And the next one is the only short story collection to make the list. I obviously love this one, and that is Seeking Fortune Elsewhere by Sinja Banu. I'm quite a shallow reader in that I'm usually drawn to a book initially because of its cover. And I saw this book cover online and thought, that is hideous. It's so sort of sickly sweet, and it really put me off the book. But then I read the blurb and I was like, this just sounds like a book I would love. So I decided to look past the cover, and I'm so glad I did, because this was pure joy to read. This is one of those collections where you think there's got to be a dud in here somewhere, because they're all so great. And there wasn't a single dud in this collection. Like every single one of them was fantastic. I'm just going to read you the start of the blurb because it's going to explain this story way better than I can. These intimate stories of South Indian immigrants and the families they left behind centres women's lives and ask how women both claim and surrender power. Travelling from Pittsburgh to Eastern Washington to Tamil Nadu, these stories about dislocation and dissonance see immigrants and their families confront the costs of leaving and staying, identifying sublime symmetries in lives growing apart. This was just a delight. And this is a collection that has quite a lot of sadness within the stories, but within all that sadness, I still felt a really deep sense of love and hope, which is actually something I'll say about the next book I'm going to talk about as well. So I guess that's something I enjoy as a reader. One of the stories that I really adored is about this old lady who is still living in India, and her children have put her in a care home for the elderly. And when the story opens, she sees one of the other residents of the care home have a heart attack and pass away in front of her. And it makes all the residents start to talk about them being in this care home. And there is a lot of pride in the fact that a lot of their children have emigrated and live in different parts of the world and are really successful. But there's this discussion of pride, where some of them are really proud of their children because they've emigrated, but others are really proud of their children because they've stayed and are planning to like take them out of the care home and live with them, which is much more traditional in Indian families. And it's just this beautiful discussion of what a family is and what it's like to be an old person, and to sort of live alone in this type of situation, and this sort of disconnect you can have from your family. I just thought it was really beautiful. Another one of the stories is about a woman who, her family live in the US, and she decides that she's sort of really unhappily married to her husband and there's no love left between them. So she decides to divorce him, which within their community is sort of unheard of. And because she wants the divorce, he demands that she leave and that he keeps their daughters. And the story is many years later when one of them is getting married and the mother's going to the wedding and sort of looking back and wondering if she did the wrong thing, and like by choosing to have this divorce, she basically gave up her daughters. And it's this sort of heartbreaking story about how, you know, as the reader, you think she did the right thing to not live unhappily married for all these years, but how, because of that, she sort of lost her daughters in doing so. Just so many. Another story is about a mother whose son has recently passed away, but he was sort of obsessed with collecting all different sort of fragments from nature, like small fossils or pine cones or like interestingly shaped leaves. And at a local natural history museum, there was this sort of competition on where you would bring in these items, and once you brought in a certain amount, you could get this like piece of like an artifact, which I can't remember what it was, but it's an artifact they have on the wall that he's always wanted. And after he passes away, his mother continues to go to the Natural History Museum to hand in these artefacts. And it's about what happens when one of the people working at the museum realised that her son's passed away, and that she shouldn't really still be taking part in the competition. It's absolutely devastating. And I just think there's a real lightness of touch to all these stories, in that there are quite a few people that you could choose to judge, but there isn't really any judgment. She's very sort of open-hearted and compassionate, and these stories are filled with empathy and, like I said, with hope and love. I absolutely love this. And if you're somebody who's like unsure if you like short stories, I feel like this is a good collection to start with, because, well, I just loved it. So, and also, as the blurb says, these stories are mainly centred around women, which is like completely what I'm into, so loved it. The next one is The Strangers by Katharina Vermette. So this is a companion novel to The Break, which I reread in 2022, and I gave both of them 5 stars. I would recommend that you read The Break first and then read The Strangers, because chronologically that's how they're set. You follow one family in The Break, and there is one character who is then in this book, and also her family are within this story. So, as I said, Phoenix is a character in The Break, and you follow her in this book. And you also follow her younger sister, her mother and her grandmother. These women are all Métis women from the Winnipeg area, and they all have these devastating stories. One of the things I find really interesting about these books is you jump between each of the characters. Some are first person, some are third person, but each of them you're following for a different amount of years. So you follow the grandmother for I think 20 years. Then you follow the mother for a slightly shorter period. The younger daughter you follow over 6 years, and Phoenix you follow over sort of a couple of years, and that's handled it's really well done. It's not really that noticeable, and she tells each story equally well. So the premise of this is that Phoenix is in a youth detention centre because of a crime she's committed, and she has really bad anger issues that she's trying to overcome. That's sort of as much as I want to tell you about her story, because it's connected to The Break. Then her younger sister, who is called Cedar Sage, is in foster care because both Phoenix and Cedar Sage were taken away from their mother, who was a drug addict, or is a drug addict. And so you're following Cedar Sage initially in foster care, and then her father, who she's never met, reaches out and gets custody of her. And you're sort of following her growing up through her teenage years as she tries to reconnect with both her sister in prison and her mother, who is still struggling with addiction. And then you follow their mother's story, Elsie, and you basically follow her from the age of 15, and you see what sort of happened to her to make her be a drug addict. It's this book is really hard to read, just filled with trigger warnings. I think there's actually a section at the front where it tells you all the trigger warnings in the book, which is pretty much everything. And what Katharina Vermette does so well is she's telling you all these heartbreaking moments in these women's lives that are all because of a failure in the social care system, but she doesn't tell you it in a way that's sort of spoon feeding you this information. At no point does she lose her subtlety. At no point does this become really heavy-handed. Again, there's a real lightness of touch in the way she delivers this information. And even though, you know, pretty much all of these stories, other than Cedar Sages, feels hopeless, there is always hope, because other than the grandmother, who you don't like at all, like she is someone who's had something bad happen to her, but is just filled with bitterness and then treats everyone in her family quite awfully. You feel a deep sense of love and hope for these women, and you want them to succeed. But this book is realistic. This book is very sort of slice of life, in that it ends at a point where, you know, you almost could keep going and hear another story. I really hope she brings out another companion novel. I think there's other characters who you could easily follow and still bring these characters into it in some way. I loved this, and I think this is a book that's very compassionate in that it's looking at these people that you could choose to judge. You know, Phoenix is in prison for an awful crime she's committed. Elsie's children have been taken away from her and have gone through awful things because they're in the foster care system. But at all points you understand why these girls and women have got to where they are, and how they've never really been given the chance to have anything more than what they have. So yeah, this is very heartbreaking. I think you should definitely look into content warnings, but I absolutely loved this one. The next book I'm going to talk about, I've just realised, has quite a few similarities with both The Strangers and Crow Lakes. There's definitely things I really enjoy. I love a family drama. I particularly love when that is sort of split across a couple of time periods. And I also love when you get multiple character perspectives. So this book is The Arsonist City by Hala Alian. And quite a few people recommended this to me, and I'm so glad they did, because I had such a fun time reading this. Again, this is the one I read over the summer, and I can just remember sitting outside in the garden and just having so much fun reading this. For me, this is quite... not quite as depressing as a lot of the books I usually read. There are definitely incredibly sad moments with this book, and this book opens with a man being executed, so it's in no way uplifting, but there's quite a lot of humour to this book. There's quite a few snarky characters, and there are quite a few moments of sort of love and joy. So yeah, this one is perhaps a bit less bleak compared to the previous book. The premise of this is that we have 3 adult children and their 2 parents. One of the parents is from Lebanon and one is from Syria. And we get the mother's perspective from when she was a sort of woman in her late teens, early 20s. And we find out how she met their father and sort of all the secrets and lies to their story, because the children don't really know the true story to how their parents met. Their mother doesn't appear to like going back to the family home, and nobody really knows why. So you're seeing the mother's story, and you're finding out all the truth to the parents' relationship. And then you're following the 3 adult siblings as well. One of them is a sort of really famous and successful rock star who lives in Beirut. One of them lives in, I think, Brooklyn, and the other lives in California. And at the start of the book, the father has decided that he wants to do a kind of like funeral for his father back in Beirut. And so he's asked if everybody will go back to the family home for this funeral. But what they don't realise is that he's actually intending to sell the family home. And because they're all sort of executors on the paperwork, he needs them all to agree and needs them all to sign. So he's sort of tricking them to get them all back. And there is a lot of tension in this family, particularly between the 2 parents and then between the 3 siblings. The siblings all feel that their mother loves the son the most, that she sort of helps him out more than the others, both financially and sort of emotionally. And they always feel this sort of lack of affection from their mother because of that. The brother feels a lot of shame because he wanted to be a successful musician, and instead his younger sister is incredibly successful. So that's sort of a divide in their relationship. And then the parents have all these secrets between them that mean they have this really odd relationship. And so basically through all these different perspectives, you get to see everybody like in every facet of them. And this is something I've mentioned many times before. I love when you meet a character and you're like, God, you seem a bit rude, or like a bit mean or selfish. And then you see their story from another perspective and you realise why they're acting the way they do. And this book does this like tenfold. You get to see them from so many different perspectives, and the story gradually gets filled in until you get to the end and you're like, God, like so much shit has gone down. There is no wonder these people are all so messed up. But there's still a lot of happiness and, like I said, a lot of comedy. These characters are really funny, and I just really enjoyed spending time with them all. I'd happily like read loads more books about all of these characters, and I never ever was in a perspective and was thinking, oh God, I wish I wasn't in this one. I wish I could get back to so-and-so, because as soon as I was in one person's voice, I was just enjoying hearing their story. So yeah, I really loved this. This is filled with loads of themes I've not even had a chance to touch on, but I would highly recommend it. And then lastly, I'm sure all of you would have guessed that this would be my book of the year, and it is, and that is Ohio by Stephen Markley. I listened to this and also read it on audio, and I would highly recommend going that route because it has several different audiobook narrators for each of the different characters. This is again a multiple perspective with different timelines. Can you tell I like that? This is just a fucking masterpiece. Like, this is one of those books where I was reading it and I was aware that it's incredibly pretentious and very overwritten. Okay, there's a lot of words in this book. It's very wordy. There's some very long sentences. This is filled with political commentary, just every type of commentary you can imagine. There's so much packed into this book, but it, I think, is successful in handling all those themes. I felt like smarter for having read it. I felt challenged by it. It felt like when I got to the end and I realised what was happening, I just couldn't believe he'd managed to like build all this up to this point. This book literally has everything. I don't even know how to describe it. So it says on the back, one sweltering night in 2013, 4 former high school classmates converge on their hometown in northeastern Ohio. So you follow these 4 perspectives. There's a different voice actor for each. They're all amazing. And they all have these really different lives. And as you get each of their perspectives, what this author is very good at, I've just started reading his newer book that has just come out. He is very good at introducing you to a character in the present day, and then when you're in their brain, they're just constantly reflecting, and they can reflect on one memory and then it can like jump to another and another and another, and you'll sort of forget you were even in the present day because there's just so much like inner monologue. And in getting all their memories, it slowly builds up to you realising that like shit's probably going to go down this night because of something that happened many, many years ago that is like really dark and twisted and has sort of been never properly discussed. And yeah, I don't really want to say any more than that. Like I said, there's so much interesting commentary, in particular on war and on environmental devastation, for greed, and to sort of plunder the world for its resources. There's a lot of commentary on like rural areas in the US that are poverty stricken and the feeling that some people will never be able to leave these towns. Yeah, I just loved it. Each voice is so distinct. I don't really know how to talk about this one because there's so much going on. But like I said, I just thought this was a masterpiece. It blew my mind. This is one of those books you could read again and again and again, and I'm sure each time you read it, you would just pick up on so much more because there's so much going on in this book. Some people would absolutely hate it. It's the one on my list that I'm probably the most confident that this book is the most Marmite of them all. But I think for the people who will love it, they will also agree with me that it's like a complete masterpiece. I think this author, if you met him, could be a bit annoying. He's clearly incredibly intelligent and isn't afraid to show it. But in book form, I was just absolutely blown away. So yeah, that is my number 1 read of the year. And I'm very happy to be now starting his new book, which is 900 pages long, having lots of fun with that. And it has 14 different audiobook narrators. So yeah, buckle up. So those are my 10 favourite books of 2022. I would love to know if you've read any of these books. I'd love to know your thoughts on them. Please, please, please recommend me books based on these, like any of the themes I've mentioned or the structures or anything like that. I'd love to know if you have any recommendations based on those, and I'd also love to know what your favourite reads of 2022 were. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!